Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Rosalind Franklin University Women in Science and Healthcare Seminar Series. My name is Lise Elliott, and on behalf of my co-chair, Christine Burgess, and our outstanding WISH team, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us for what's going to be a fascinating and important seminar. And I want to acknowledge the fact that we have a beautiful room full of people, live people here in person, as well as many more joining us on Zoom. So welcome, both remote and in person, where this is our beta testing of a hybrid seminar. We're very excited about this. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background into the WISH Symposium, which we inaugurated in 2016 with generous support from the university. And our aim is to honor our namesake and highlight the promise and struggles of women in science and healthcare. Over these 6 years, we've addressed many issues, including gender bias, gender segregation in healthcare professions, and this year's theme, which is intersectionality in health equity. If you missed our September symposium featuring, I realized we're going to take these off, featuring the outstanding Gianni Lewis, I encourage you to check out the video on our website. Our seminar today will touch on all of these issues while shining light down a deep hole, pay disparities, a gnawing problem that persists despite women's longstanding majority in the healthcare workforce. It's a good time then to acknowledge that our acronym WISH is perhaps more aspirational than we'd like. It's time to stop wishing and time to start acting on remedying gender disparities in pay across the healthcare professions. So with that, allow me to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Amy Gottlieb, whose work has addressed this problem head on. Dr. Gottlieb is Professor of Medicine and Obstetrics and Gynecology and Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs at the UMass Chan School of Medicine, Bay State campus in Springfield, Massachusetts. She's also Chief Faculty Development Officer at Bay State Health, a large diversified health system in Western Massachusetts. Dr. Gottlieb joined the executive leadership team of UMass in 2015 to help establish the new regional medical school focused on population health. Prior to that, she was on the faculty at Brown University, where she served in numerous educational, clinical, and administrative leadership roles. Dr. Gottlieb received her undergrad degree in economics from Harvard and her medical degree from our Southside neighbor, the University of Chicago's Pritzker School of Medicine. She completed a residency in general internal medicine at Brown. And then prior to entering medicine, Dr. Gottlieb actually worked in corporate finance, which is a great prelude to the work she's doing now. She's currently chair-elect of the AAMC's Group on Women in Medicine and Science and former chair of the Society of General Internal Medicine's Women and Medicine Commission. She founded that society's career advising program and has sponsored over 350 women faculty nationwide, and for which she received the prestigious Elnora M. Rhodes Service Award, symbolizing the highest level of service to the organization. Dr. Gottlieb has led national initiatives to address salary equity and encourage organizational leaders to pay attention to workplace practices in recruiting, hiring, evaluation, and promotion that inadvertently benefit men and disadvantage women. Her book, Closing the Gender Pay Gap in Medicine, a Roadmap for Healthcare Organizations and the Women and Physicians Who Work for Them, came out just in early 2021. So this is hot off the press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gottlieb to Rosalind Franklin University to present her seminar, Closing the Gender Pay Gap in Medicine, Identifying Drivers of Inequity and Devising Solutions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elliott. Can everybody hear me? So this is really fabulous. This is my first live talk since November 2019. So it's wonderful to see all your faces. And I apologize in advance. I'm looking at a bunch of different screens so we can also communicate the seminar to our online viewers. But I am today speaking, as Dr. Elliott said, on closing the gender pay gap in medicine. And I'm going to take some time to talk with you all about the data on the gender pay gap and on the context in which it emerges, and then talk specifically about the impact of the gender pay gap on accumulated wealth, and do a very, very deep dive into compensation methodology and the drivers of disparities within that calculus. I'll then talk about organizational strategies, which for the med students in the room, thank you for coming twice in one day, is really where I think the levers lie for addressing and eliminating the gender pay gap. But I will talk a little bit about individual strategies and individual self-advocacy, and then round up with some Q&A. And I have left about 10 or 15 minutes at the end, and I look forward to that conversation. So for the first time in history, the number of women exceeds the number of men in US medical schools. In fact, for 40 years or so, women have represented a significant proportion of med school graduates and currently account for almost half of med students, graduate medical trainees, and faculty kind of in total nationwide. Despite this workforce representation for decades, women continue to experience well-documented disparities in opportunity and compensation within academic medicine and healthcare writ large. These inequities are interrelated, and addressing one successfully necessarily implies understanding and mitigating the others. So we can think of the gender pay gap as a crucible in which all the forces that diminish women's professional value within our medical institutions converge. The equity of opportunity that really should be flowing from this numeric parity is not materializing. Women's advancement trajectory in academic medicine looks like a funnel. With fewer and fewer women, the higher one goes in seniority and leadership. The data show that 25% of full professors are women, only 18% of department chairs are women, and only 18% of med school deans are women, except for here. And on the business side of the house, women's advancement trajectory looks the same, with fewer and fewer women, the higher one goes in seniority and leadership. So in addition to these gender disparities in achieving senior academic rank and organizational leadership roles, the data consistently shows that, there are inequities in research support and compensation, and that these disparities exist even after accounting for numerous confounders like age, experience, productivity, and professional commitment. Now, it's really important for me at this juncture to acknowledge that women of color experience even greater disparities in these domains and face considerable barriers to advancement. Women of color experience an inadequate pipeline and low representation among our faculty ranks. And for those who do become faculty, most remain at junior positions. So now I'd like to turn to some compensation data. As I told the medical students today, in this country, women physicians earn 75 cents on the dollar compared with their equally talented male counterparts. Women PAs earn 93 cents on the dollar after their first year of training, and interestingly and disappointingly, that wage gap has been shown to increase by $200 for every year of work experience. Nurse practitioners also are not immune, with women earning $13K less than men, according to some studies. Women faculty earn less than men at every academic rank and in every specialty. So in sum, women physicians in this country experience one of the largest gender pay gaps in the US labor market. And unfortunately, these inequities, and this is for docs, this is for PAs, this is for NPs, have been shown repeatedly to begin right out of training. Now, some of you may be aware that the Association of American Medical Colleges conducts an annual faculty salary survey in which it collects and publishes compensation data on tens of thousands of faculty, medical school faculty nationwide. In 2019, for the first time, the AAMC reported this data broken down by gender. And happily, just in October of this year, it published the data by gender and race and ethnicity. So we now have the opportunity within academic medicine to take a look at the compensation trends and gaps through an intersectional lens. So this groundbreaking report reflects about 100,000 faculty across the US. And what it showed was that the biggest gender pay gap occurred among women physician faculty in clinical departments. Among these faculty, and this is the most current data we could possibly get, women were paid between 67 and 77 cents on the dollar compared with white male physicians. Moreover, women physician faculty, regardless of race or ethnicity, earned less than men of every race and ethnicity. So within race data, I'm presented here showing that male physicians earn more than women, thank you, of the same race and ethnicity. And so what that within their same racial or ethnic group. And so what this really implies is that the primary driver of compensation inequities is gender. These findings echo trends in the US labor market as a whole, where men, regardless of race, earn more than women of any race when education is held constant. So when we translate these advancement in compensation disparities into the healthcare marketplace, it's understandable why women comprise only a tiny proportion, a small proportion of the top earners in academic medicine, despite representing a considerable proportion of the physician pipeline. Additionally, advancement disparities and a lifetime suppression of wages have considerable impact on the concept of cumulative wealth of women in medicine and science, and carry significant implications for retirement choices and post-retirement quality of life. I talked a little bit about this with the students today. So I'd like to do a bit of a dive into this notion of accumulated wealth. Specifically, I'd like to talk about a study. It's one of my favorite studies. It was very elegantly done by a group of colleagues at Hopkins and published a couple years ago. These individuals, these researchers, performed an accumulated wealth simulation in which they looked at over 3,300 faculty salaries across the School of Medicine. About a third were women, and longitudinal promotion data over about a decade. And the investigators were specifically looking at effects of gender differences on total salary and accumulated wealth over a 30-year academic career. And of course, they adjusted for potential confounders like department and rank and degree and years in rank. So the most compelling finding of this very elegantly done study was that even a really, really small gender pay gap, so less than 3%, translated into large differences in accumulated wealth. Specifically, in this simulation, owing to the cumulative effect of salary and promotional disparities over a career, a woman faculty member would find herself in a situation where she would have to spend her retirement savings at a rate 40% lower than her male counterparts to compensate for less retirement money and longer life expectancy. Or if she spent at the same rate, she would run out of money 7 years before her death. So there are multiple inflection points in a woman's career trajectory where our traditional way of paying folks, of valuing the work they do, disproportionately rewards the way men, physicians, and faculty have been working and living for generations. It is critical that we identify, acknowledge, and address these contextual forces as we set about the practice of paying equally talented women less than their male counterparts. So now it's time for some compensation methodology. And I'd like to talk specifically about comp and the structure and its impact on the gender pay gap. So consider that compensation methodology typically rests on a formula of base salary determined by commercially available benchmarking data plus additional monetary reward for rank, leadership, and productivity. If the goal is total cash compensation, we can see how common compensation methodology contributes structurally to gender-based salary inequities because of women's diminished earning potential in each domain. For example, regarding base salary, there is often considerable difference between the dollar amounts at the low and high ends of the benchmark ranges, allowing organizations wide berth in making compensation determinations. Salary expectations and vigorousness of negotiation during initial hire are therefore critical to establishing where an individual faculty member falls in the established range and are potentially vulnerable to gender bias. Productivity-based compensation is negatively impacted by increased demands for organizational service, increased time spent with patients, resulting in better outcomes, but lower volumes, and greater responsibility for domestic duties compared with male colleagues. Similarly, limited formal leadership roles and less sponsorship, we're going to talk about this in a minute, to access those roles decrease the compensation that attaches to these opportunities. So I'd like to explore a few of these elements individually, and in order to do so, I'm going to need to describe a concept known as second-generation gender bias, which the med students and I talked at length about today. So second-generation gender bias is different from the sexism that existed pre-Title VII and pre-Title IX in that there's not an overt intention to exclude. Instead, these biases are embedded in our unconscious stereotypes and our expectations of what leaders look like and how men and women should behave and how women's work is assigned and valued. Now, I don't know if y'all can see this cartoon really well, but I love this cartoon. It's essentially a depiction of an older gentleman lying in his hospital bed. He's obviously disgruntled. And outside his room are his providers, his physicians, talking to presumably his family. And the caption reads, "We're doing everything we can to make him comfortable, short of dressing up as male doctors." So these prescriptive societal and organizational norms are the engines behind why our talented women are failing to reach their potential, their professional potential, and being paid less. Specifically, they are the drivers behind the gendered career paths we see in medicine and the consistent observation that women are assigned more non-promotable tasks in our organization and experience backlash when leading and negotiating. So research reveals that within healthcare, on both the academic and the business sides of the house, women tend to advance in areas that are consultative and supportive, rather than those with quantitative or managerial responsibility. So in academic medicine, women who advance to decanal roles tend to do so in faculty affairs. That's actually an older picture of me pre-COVID hair, as opposed to as research deans or clinical affairs deans. On the corporate side of the house, women C-suite leaders tend to hold titles like chief HR officer, or chief legal officer. Not only are these quantitative and managerial roles the incubators for the dean and the CEO positions, but they're also the gateways to the compensation that accrues to these executive leadership positions. So I've talked a lot about this today, which I love, occupational gender segregation. So there's emerging evidence that shows that women trainees continue to be directed towards certain specialties like pediatrics that require traditionally feminine attributes and away from procedural or more technical ones like ortho. And as I've mentioned a couple times earlier this afternoon, this phenomenon is called occupational gender segregation, and it has tremendous consequences for pay equity. In the US labor market writ large, a loss of prestige and a decline in earnings have been shown to occur after a large number of women enter a field or occupation. When an entire specialty loses ground in terms of relative compensation, and that's reflected in the salary benchmarks that our institutions use, the earning potential of women entering that field or those fields is put at considerable risk. Another manifestation of second-generation gender bias, as I mentioned, is that women have been shown to spend more time on non-promotable tasks within their institutions. So this is work that has little visibility or impact, work that benefits the organization, but doesn't necessarily contribute to performance evaluations or metrics for advancement. This is institutional housework. And the types of work vary by industry, but they're readily identified. Now, there's some really interesting research around this volunteerism or this gendered volunteerism that shows that in mixed gendered groups, women are more likely to volunteer than men. They receive more requests to volunteer than men, and they're more likely to say yes when they're asked to volunteer. So there's this implicit understanding that women will raise their hands more often for these citizenship-like activities. I'd like to talk next about the double binds that women face when trying to advance in their careers and when behaving like traditional leaders. We also talked a lot about this today with the medical students. So there are these implicit expectations around women's behavior organizationally and in society writ large that are often at odds with well-accepted, desirable leadership traits. Women are expected to be directive, yet participative, decisive, yet caring, executive, yet approachable. What's driving this phenomenon? Well, there are long-standing, long-held cultural expectations and unconscious stereotypes that women are to be nice and caretaking and other-focused, whereas leaders and high performers are to be decisive and assertive and independent. And there is a very well-described, I mean, at this point, over a decade of literature, a well-described backlash when one's behavior violates these gender stereotypes. There is a social penalty in the workplace for women who behave like leaders. And this impacts how women are described and evaluated. And this starts in medical school. I mean, a lot of the compelling data actually around disparate terminology used to describe men and women comes out of the learner community. And so this also dictates how effectively women can self-advocate and lead. This likability paradox is highlighted nicely in a study that was described in Harvard Business Review in 2018, in which investigators looked at 81,000 performance evaluations from the US Naval Academy, both men and women. And what they showed was that women were evaluated more negatively despite no differences in objective measures. So no differences in grades, in fitness scores, in class standing. Women were judged less competent than men of equal qualification, and were assigned more negative attributes. Additionally, the most commonly used positive term to describe men was analytical. For women, it was compassionate. Now, you may say to yourself, oh, analytical, compassionate, those are both positive. But which is more valuable from an organizational standpoint? Analytical is task-oriented. It speaks to an individual's ability to reason, to interpret, to strategize. So when considering whom to hire, whom to promote, whom to compensate, which attribute is going to take the prize? Turning to negotiation, it's important to acknowledge that at its essence, job negotiation is really an interpersonal exchange between a job seeker and an evaluator. Job seekers violating unconscious stereotypes have been shown to experience backlash. And backlash in the context of these studies was defined as social and economic punishments for engaging in behavior inconsistent with what's expected for members of one's social identity group. Now, there's also data that negotiating salary significantly decreases hireability for women candidates compared with male candidates, and that male evaluators in particular penalize women who negotiate. So it's important to acknowledge that men and women face different costs when deciding to initiate salary negotiations or negotiations for resources. In sum, women face a unique professional challenge of having an implicit background identity of unconscious social expectations around their behavior that they have to navigate. And this is, there's this cultural context in which women have to battle the expectations of being feminine while simultaneously fulfilling requisites of advancement and leadership. And this is costly psychologically, and it results in self-censorship and attrition with tremendous consequences for pay equity, as I said. It's also a suboptimal business model because we really need to be harnessing the talents of our entire workforce. So as we consider how elements of second-generation gender bias can undermine equity in the productivity domains of our traditional compensation calculus, we really need to look no further than the pandemic. Before this pandemic, as we all know, has had a regressive effect on women in the workplace in general. And before 2020, all recessions depressed employment equally or impacted men more. However, in the COVID-19 pandemic, the job losses, as I'm sure everyone knows, have been much more significant for women. And the drivers of this phenomenon are likely that women are heavily employed in sectors affected by the shutdowns, and also have had to shoulder increased childcare responsibilities because of school and daycare closures, and then the switch to remote learning. And the data, the economic data, are clear and consistent that mothers' work hours fell significantly more than fathers during the initial surge of the pandemic, that working remotely did not mitigate this disparity for mothers of young children. And this to me was a really compelling data point. With the return to remote schooling in September of 2020, 80% of the individuals who left the workforce that month, that's about 1 million folks, were women. So the reason it's important for me to raise all this kind of economic context is because in terms of today's topic, what's concerning is that historically, so before COVID-19, workers who diminish employment during a recession have been shown to experience highly persistent earnings losses and diminished career opportunities. So the healthcare sector, as we all know, has been significantly disrupted during COVID. When we look at our industry in particular, the data show that women in medicine and science have done more double shift work during the height of the pandemic. And, pre-pandemic, there was 2 decades at least of data showing that women physicians and faculty had increased responsibilities for dependent care, domestic duties, and childcare disruptions compared with men. And now there has been consistent evidence of diminished workforce engagement and productivity as a result of the pandemic, as evidenced by a variety of things, including decreased journal submissions and first author publications, and the consistent sounds of alarm from our colleagues in the peer-reviewed literature at the national academies and in the lay press. So this labor force disengagement has profound implications for productivity, compensation, and career advancement, and has been referred to in the literature as economic scarring. So when talking about the productivity component of traditional compensation methodology, I really would be remiss if I didn't devote a minute or two to addressing the RVU conundrum. The RVU, as I'm sure most of you know, or relative value unit, was adopted by CMS in 1992 as a mechanism for physician payment. It's a standardized unit that is based on the cost of providing medical services, and physician work comprises over half of the valuation. There has been a lot of discussion over the years about the questionable methodology underlying this valuation of physician work, because it's based on surveys of physicians who perform the service, and the survey response rates are very low, and surveys are also subjective. The RVU was also designed to value medical services, not to measure physician performance. And as such, it incentivizes more, but not better care. And volume-based productivity has been described as an imperfect measure of physician work that really does not align with 21st century healthcare goals. Like I'm sure all the trainees are learning, patient-centered care and teamwork and quality. It also has been described as a mechanism to monetize the doctor-patient relationship. I would offer, additionally, it has tremendous potential to penalize women who spend more time with patients, engaging in more patient-centered communication and psychosocial lines of inquiry. This is all evidence-based, who demonstrate lower volumes, but better quality outcomes and more guideline adherence. Furthermore, based on some of the elements of second-generation gender bias that I've outlined, there's also significant potential that women may have less access or limited access to RVU generating activities like weekend call, and to highly remunerative RVUs because they're overrepresented in non-procedural specialties. So what can organizations do to close the gender pay gap in medicine? I'd like to peel back the onion a little bit. As we set about correcting the practice of paying equally talented women faculty less than their male counterparts, as I mentioned and hopefully communicated, it is critical that we identify, acknowledge, and address the contextual forces that perpetuate it. In parallel, however, we also have to recognize that equitable compensation is, at its essence, a business endeavor, meriting the same attention to detail and rigor afforded other operating costs. What this means is that closing the gender pay gap in medicine is going to require our colleagues in HR and finance to take a good hard look at the basic assumptions underlying our institutional compensation methodologies, to understand the expectations and the outcomes that they generate, to create new approaches that better account for women's unique contributions and the biases facing them, and to track and report gender metrics at all compensation touch points. So for those administrative leaders in the room, this is the stuff we do all the time for operations margins, right? While few individuals would argue with the concept of equal pay for equal work, It's really how to achieve this goal that overwhelms institutions and their leaders. Organizations need a roadmap to assess how their current compensation methodologies are perpetuating pay inequities, how to build the governance structures and coalitions and processes necessary to incorporate equity principles into routine business practices, and how to create the dialogue and consistent messaging and cascaded information to achieve organizational transformation around gender equity. Dr. Elliott mentioned this book. About a year ago, a group of colleagues and I published a book that aimed specifically to help organizations do all this. And the link is here if you'd like to learn more. We also have to recognize the importance of culture change to this endeavor. So culture is defined as a set of collective norms and behaviors. And there are many elements to culture change, including articulating the aspiration, what we're doing here today, hiring to align with the target culture, fostering organizational conversations around how we're doing and meeting that target, and intentionally reshaping practices and patterns of interaction in the workplace that inadvertently benefit men, disadvantage women, and drive the gender pay gap. What we're really talking about here is building a culture in which men and women are not limited by role expectations. And this, like most things in life, really begins with ourselves and reflection about how we individually make decisions and what our own perceptions are. We have to be really mindful of the language we use. For example, in introductions and evaluations, linguistic biases implicitly communicate stereotypes and contribute to the maintenance of gender norms that women have less standing and less expertise. As some of you may know, there's significant evidence that women physicians and scientists and faculty are introduced with their professional titles considerably less often than their male counterparts, and are, as I've alluded to, evaluated with fewer standout adjectives despite similar qualifications. We also need to pay attention, and this is really where a lot of my work around closing the gender pay gap has come in. We need to pay attention to the processes in our organizations in which unconscious biases can emerge, like recruiting and hiring and salary setting and evaluation and promotion. And we also need to be intentionally sponsoring high potential women for leadership roles. So, in the vein of paying attention, we can only manage what we measure. So if folks are not already doing so, we really have to start tracking gender representation among our applicants, our offers, our promotions, our leadership roles, and our departures as well. We need to expect unconscious bias training for everyone involved in these processes where bias can and does emerge. And we need to be conducting salary audits, especially given the data around initial and final offers at hire. So I think that last point merits an emphasis, because as we've seen, women experience pay disparities right out of training, and even small differences in compensation can have significant impact on accumulated wealth. Additionally, setting up a new hire for success, involves having adequate resources to do one's work. So now I'd like to talk in detail about sponsorship, which is something that I spent a lot of time talking and thinking about and writing about early in my career, before I knew that I would get, so impassioned about closing the gender pay gap. They're very related, as you'll see. So sponsorship is critical to operationalizing the value of equal opportunity within an organizational culture by helping to dismantle these second-generation gender biases I have described. Women in medicine and science have a visibility gap, and sponsorship facilitates access to the platforms and the networks necessary for talent and merit to become visible, recognized, and rewarded. to make sure we're all on the same page, I want to just take a minute and talk about the differences between mentorship and sponsorship, because they are different. So mentorship tends to center on personal and professional development, on skill building and goal setting. A mentor is someone who provides feedback and expertise and whose impact really does not depend on rank or position. Sponsorship, however, focuses explicitly on enhancing visibility and credibility and networks. A sponsor is someone who facilitates recognition and access, and whose impact depends, importantly, on position and organizational influence. So there are limitations of mentorship in terms of supporting upward career mobility because of mentorship's traditionally narrow scope. So think about, mentoring someone on a research project, and also because of its focus on mentee behavior. Sponsorship, however, as I've said, directly targets career advancement. So it's anchored in a sponsor's awareness of organizational structures and opportunities. And its focus is literally persuading institutional decision makers to see a protege's capabilities. I love this Venn diagram that was published a few years ago by some general internal medicine colleagues of mine at Hopkins. And it's a great way to kind of think about the differences and the similarities between sponsorship and mentorship. And I want to point out a couple in particular. So the first is that, mentorship is often a longitudinal relationship and can be quite transformative, whereas sponsorship can be episodic and transactional. Now, the business community has known about it and published about sponsorship for over a decade, and specifically its value in supporting one's ability to gain promotion, increasing satisfaction with rates of advancement, supporting stretch assignments, improving gender parity in advancement, and putting upward pressure on pay. So academic medicine came to the table a little bit late, but I would argue that as early as 2014, there was some conversation about this concept without the word sponsorship in the medical literature. So in that year, Rochelle DeCastro and her colleagues out at University of Michigan looked at a very large group of K awardees. And what these investigators showed was that promoting a mentee's career through networking and advocating for the mentee influenced career satisfaction. So I would argue, right, that networking and advocacy is really sponsorship. A few years later, Patton and colleagues, also from Michigan, looked at another large group of K awardees and showed that reported sponsorship experiences were significantly associated with academic success. And an academic success in this context was defined as a certain amount of research funding, a certain number of peer-reviewed pubs, and certain formal leadership titles. That same year, a colleague of mine, Dr. Brita Roy, and we published some early data on a sponsorship program. Dr. Elliott mentioned this, that I had established in 2013 for the Society of General Internal Medicine. And what we showed was that participants reported promotion to the next rank and expanded job opportunities in association with their engagement with the program. So we have to be very intentional about sponsoring women, because sponsorship that happens informally or without a mandate for inclusion most often benefits white men. These figures, this is from the Patton study, underscores how men in academic medicine were reporting more sponsorship experiences than their women colleagues. So what does sponsorship look like on the ground? Intentionality, as I've alluded to, is essential because sponsorship that develops organically tends to exclude a significant proportion of the talent pool. Structured programs also can proactively link sponsors based on standardized criteria. They can thoughtfully match sponsors and proteges set out clear expectations of engagement, and identify program objectives, monitor outcomes, and solicit feedback. It's critical that our topmost leaders are sponsors themselves and promote sponsorship as an organizational value. To emphasize the importance of this activity of sponsorship and leadership opportunity as they relate to compensation, I'm going to take a minute and just share some data from the Mayo Clinic. So as some of you may know, the Mayo Clinic is really interesting because they've had a salary only model for 40 years. So what that means is that there is a target salary established for each specialty, and it is non-negotiable. There's no incentive pay, there's no bonus pay. By the 5th year after hire, all physicians in the specialty are paid at the same base rate. So a couple of years ago, some individuals at Mayo said, okay, we're going to take a look at this. They looked at, almost 3,000 physicians, and they wanted to see if, pay equity was really happening. And so what they revealed that that 96% of cases, gender pay equity was affirmed. When they did a little bit of a deep dive into that 4%, what they showed was one of the major drivers of the remaining inequity was that there were more men in compensable leadership roles. So now I'm going to finish up in the next couple minutes with some thoughts on individual advocacy. So as I mentioned earlier today, I wholeheartedly believe that the primary responsibility for closing the gender pay gap rests on the shoulders of our institutions for all the reasons I've laid out in the last 45 minutes. On an individual level, however, the most critical contributor to pay equity is for individual candidates to understand the playing field, the rules of the game. Evidence reveals that women negotiate as often as men, but as I've described, experience penalties for doing so. Since implicit bias limits the ability to negotiate successfully, the burden of salary equity lies beyond the control of the individual candidate. However, women will need to, until that happens, it will be essential for women to equip themselves with knowledge about salary benchmarks, institutional target ranges, and metrics for placement within those ranges in order to support their being paid equitably. There are several commercially available benchmarking data sets. One of the most commonly used in academic medicine throughout this country is the Association of American Medical Colleges Faculty Salary Survey, which I mentioned half an hour ago. This data set is intentionally available online for $43. So knowing that there are well-described penalties for self-advocacy around salary and resources, I would encourage folks to use appreciative inquiry and approach the exchange around compensation as a conversation. I would also offer that an institution or an institution's leadership response to a conversation about compensation benchmarks, target ranges, metrics, that's a good indicator of organizational culture around equity and inclusion. Last but not least, it's really essential that I mention the statutory effort around salary equity and salary history that's gone on in this country. Since in the last several years, there have been hundreds of bills across the country addressing pay equity, including in nearly every state. And these include more aggressive pay equity laws, wage transparency laws, and bans on salary history inquiries. And that last bucket, those efforts were intentionally intended to prevent successive employers from using past discriminatorily low compensation to justify pay disparities. So Illinois has a ban on salary history inquiries. And if you, wherever you land, you just go to this, for your training and beyond, just go to this website, this link, and you can look up the state where you reside or where you're looking for a job. So in summary, to close the gender pay gap, institutions really need to identify and explore factors that drive compensation calculations and develop a framework that accounts for gender inequities when assessing experience and performance and responsibilities, and that recognizes and rewards mission-aligned pockets of productivity that have been ignored. So I'm leaving you all, it's my last slide, with a call to action. Start somewhere, do something. Conduct regular salary audits to determine inequities. Identify where along the career continuum the gender pay gap is most significant. Is it among your initial hires? Is it among those who are promoted to associate professor? Review compensation methodology and consider potential drivers of disparities. And then I would say, pick a driver, just one, and tackle it. Whether that's codifying salary benchmark standards, looking at how salary negotiations are played out during initial hire and promotion, looking at representation among faculty ranks, among organizational leadership, looking at who's doing all the citizenship work around the institution, or even considering kind of what our clinical systems look like and how they could be modified to improve physician throughput. So I have a lot of references. And I want to thank you so much for your attention.
All right. Thank you so very much. I am Christine Burgess, co-chair with Dr. Lise Elliott. So I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of us from WISH. So thank you for your wonderful talk. I think we've learned a lot from this, and it gives us a lot of motivators to really work on pay equity. So thank you so much for that. I also want to take some time to also thank our WISH planning committee, which includes Nicole Ulibri, Jay Moat, Amy Hilsey, Kara Bass, and Dr. Bruce Sowers as well. So thank you to all of them, especially a big thank you to Jay and Nicole, who made sure that this hybrid experiment of ours went so smoothly. So really thank you very much to them so much for all of your work, as well as our WISH advisory committee. And then of course, all of you who are here both in person on Zoom, as well as watching our recording. So thank you so very much, everybody, and have a great evening.